December 1944. Camp Aletchville, Alabama. Behind rows of barbed wire topped with guard towers, 300 German women sat in wooden barracks that smelled of pine tar and loneliness. Most were nurses and auxiliary personnel captured in North Africa and Italy. They'd been told Americans would treat them as monsters. They'd been told to expect nothing but contempt. What they didn't expect was the knock on the barracks door 3 days before Christmas. The door opened. A group of American women stood there, holding boxes wrapped in newspaper and tied with string. Behind them, men carried tables loaded with ham, sweet potatoes, and pies that steamed in the cold air. The German women stared. One of the American women, Sarah Henderson, stepped forward and said in broken German, "Frohe Weihnachten." Merry Christmas. You're far from home. So we brought home to you. The silence that followed held 6 years of war, thousands of miles of ocean, and a chasm of grief that should have been impossible to cross. Then, one of the German women, a nurse named Margarete Schiller, began to cry. Not the quiet tears of sadness, but the shaking sobs of someone who'd forgotten what kindness looked like. Within moments, the barracks filled with the sound of weeping from both sides of the barbed wire. This wasn't supposed to happen. Everything about 1944 said this moment was impossible. American boys were dying on beaches in France and islands in the Pacific. German cities were burning under Allied bombs. Hatred was the language everyone spoke fluently. But in a small Alabama town where cotton fields stretched to the horizon and magnolia trees lined dirt roads, a different story was being written. Camp Aletchville had opened in 1943 as one of hundreds of POW camps scattered across America. Most held men, German and Italian soldiers who spent their days doing farm work and road repair. But Aletchville was different. It held women. And that changed everything. When the first transport arrived in June 1943, the town didn't know what to make of it. These weren't hardened soldiers. They were nurses, some barely out of their teens, who'd served in field hospitals in Tunisia and Sicily. They wore the same gray uniforms as male prisoners, but their faces carried a weariness that spoke of watching men die, of holding hands in final moments, of trying to save lives while bombs fell from the sky. The camp commander, Colonel James Harrison, was a career military man who'd fought in World War I. He'd seen what war did to people. He'd also seen what happened when you treated human beings like animals. They became animals. So he made a decision that raised eyebrows all the way to Washington. These women would be treated with dignity. They would have work to keep them occupied. They would have space to maintain some semblance of normal life. And they would not be hidden away like something shameful. The women worked in the camp laundry, tended a vegetable garden, and helped maintain the grounds. They had access to a library stocked with German books donated by American universities. They could write letters home, though those letters often took months to arrive and longer to return, if they returned at all. Many had no idea if their families were alive. The Allied bombing campaign had turned German cities into rubble. Every day without news was a day suspended between hope and despair. The people of Aletchville watched from a distance at first. The camp was just outside town, close enough to see but far enough to ignore. Some wanted to ignore it. They had sons and husbands overseas. They read casualty lists in the newspaper. Why should they care about enemy prisoners eating American food and sleeping in American beds? But others saw something different. They saw young women the same age as their daughters. They saw exhaustion and fear that transcended nationality. And slowly, cautiously, a few began to reach out. It started with Martha Williams, a farmer's wife whose son was fighting in Germany. She'd lost her husband to pneumonia 2 years earlier and ran the farm alone with help from her teenage daughter. One autumn day in 1943, she drove past the camp and saw prisoners working in the garden. The sight stopped her. These women were doing exactly what she did every day, coaxing food from soil, fighting weeds and weather, trying to make things grow in hard ground. She went home and baked 2 apple pies. The next day she drove back to the camp and asked to speak with the commander. Colonel Harrison met her in his office, surprised. "Ma'am, is there something I can help you with?" Martha set the pies on his desk. "These are for the women, the German women. I thought they might like something homemade." Harrison studied her for a long moment. "Mrs. Williams, your son is overseas." "Yes, sir. He's in France." "And you want to give pies to enemy prisoners. I want to give pies to young women who are far from home and probably scared. Same as my son is scared, wherever he is." Harrison accepted the pies. That evening, they were served in the mess hall. The German women stared at them, uncertain. One finally took a small bite, then another. Within minutes, both pies were gone. Several women asked who had made them. When they heard it was an American mother with a son fighting in Germany, they went quiet. The gesture was too big for words. Word spread through Aliceville. A few people were outraged. "Feeding the enemy while our boys go hungry overseas," one man complained at the general store. But others disagreed. "Those girls didn't start the war," said Eleanor Price, the Methodist minister's wife. "They're just caught in it. Same as our children." By December 1943, a small group of women had begun making regular donations to the camp. Quilts appeared when temperatures dropped. Books in German showed up at the library. Someone donated a violin. The gestures were small, almost furtive, as if people weren't quite sure it was allowed to be kind to the enemy. Then came December 1944, the camp's second Christmas. By now, the war had turned decisively against Germany. Everyone knew the end was coming, though no one knew when or how it would arrive. The German women in Aliceville existed in a strange limbo. They were safer than they would have been in Germany, where cities burned nightly under bomber raids. But safety came at the cost of everything familiar, every person they loved. Sarah Henderson had been thinking about Christmas for weeks. Her husband was a doctor at the camp, and she'd seen the women's faces grow more haunted as the holiday approached. "They have nothing," she told her friends at the church women's auxiliary. "No letters from home, no news of their families, no idea when they'll see Germany again. And Christmas is coming. What do you suggest we do?" asked Eleanor Price. "I suggest we give them Christmas." The room went silent. Finally, someone spoke up. "My nephew died at Anzio. Germans killed him." Sarah nodded. "I know. My cousin died in the Pacific. Japanese killed him. This war has taken people from all of us. But those women in that camp didn't kill anyone. They healed people. They were nurses. And they're spending Christmas behind barbed wire, wondering if their mothers and fathers are alive." The vote wasn't unanimous. 3 women walked out. But the others stayed, and they began to plan. They collected donations throughout the town. Not everyone contributed, but enough did. They gathered what they could in a time when rationing meant shortages of everything: sugar, flour, fabric, soap. Each item was precious. Each donation was a small act of faith that humanity could survive hatred. On the afternoon of December 22nd, a convoy of cars pulled up to the camp gates. Colonel Harrison had approved the plan after checking with his superiors, who'd responded with cautious permission. "Use your judgment, Colonel. But if there's any trouble, it ends immediately." There was no trouble. The German women gathered in the mess hall, confused by the sudden activity. They'd been told visitors were coming, but not who or why. When the American women entered carrying boxes and food, shock rippled through the room. The Americans had prepared a Christmas feast. ham glazed with precious brown sugar, sweet potato casserole topped with marshmallows that had required weeks of ration stamp saving, green beans with bacon, cornbread made with butter instead of lard, apple and pecan pies baked that morning. The smell alone was overwhelming. But it was the gifts that broke something open. Each German woman received a small package. Inside were simple things: a bar of lavender soap, a handkerchief embroidered with flowers, a small mirror, a comb, a pair of thick wool socks. Things that said, "You matter. You are a person, not just a prisoner." Margarete Schiller, the nurse who'd been captured at Anzio, unwrapped her package with shaking hands. Inside was a bar of soap that smelled like rose. For 2 years she'd washed with the harsh lye soap issued by the camp. This soap was soft, scented, feminine. It was the first thing she'd received since her capture that acknowledged she was a woman, not just an enemy. She pressed it to her face and breathed in, and the tears came. Around her, other women were crying too. Some tried to hide it, maintaining the stoic discipline drilled into them by years of military service. Others gave up and let the emotion pour out. The American women stood awkwardly at first, uncertain how to respond to this flood of grief and gratitude. Then Martha Williams walked over to a young German prisoner who was sobbing into her hands and put her arms around her. The young woman stiffened, then melted into the embrace. "Danke," she whispered. "Thank you. Thank you." Other American women followed Martha's lead. Language barriers dissolved in the universal grammar of comfort. They held these women who were supposed to be enemies and let them cry. They cried too, for all the boys who wouldn't come home, for all the families shattered by war, for all the normal life that had been stolen from everyone. When the tears finally subsided, they ate together. The American women had planned to serve the food and leave, maintaining some distance. But Colonel Harrison suggested they stay, and they did. Germans and Americans sat side by side at long tables, passing dishes and trying to communicate in broken bits of each other's languages. Someone started singing Silent Night in German. Still knocked. The American women joined in English. The two versions wove together, different words carrying the same meaning: peace, hope, the belief that something better was possible. Later, one of the German women, a former music teacher named Hilda Braun, played the donated violin. She performed Bach, Brahms, and German Christmas carols. Then, hesitantly, she played "O Come All Ye Faithful," an attempt to bridge the gap with a melody both sides knew. The music filled the mess hall, soaring above the barbed wire and guard towers, above nations and armies, above everything that said this moment couldn't happen. The party lasted 3 hours. When it ended, the American women gathered their empty dishes and prepared to leave. The German women lined up spontaneously, wanting to say goodbye, to express something too big for words. They shook hands, hugged, pressed notes of thanks written in careful English into American palms. As the last car drove away, Margarete stood at the barracks window and watched the taillights disappear. Around her, the other women examined their gifts again, touching the soap and handkerchiefs as if they might vanish. "I don't understand," said one of the younger nurses. "Why did they do this? We're the enemy." Margarete thought about Martha Williams, who had a son fighting in Germany, but had still baked pies for German prisoners. She thought about Sarah Henderson, who'd organized this entire event knowing some people would call her a traitor. She thought about all those American women who donated their ration stamps and their time to give Christmas to people they had every right to hate. "Maybe," Margarete said slowly, "they see us the way they'd want someone to see their sons and daughters if they were prisoners somewhere. Maybe that's what humanity looks like. Treating people like people, even when everything says you shouldn't. The impact of that Christmas party rippled far beyond one evening. Word spread through the POW camp network. Other camps began receiving similar donations, though none matched the scale or intimacy of what happened at Aliceville. The story reached newspapers, where reactions split sharply. Some praised it as an example of American values triumphing over hatred. Others condemned it as coddling the enemy while American soldiers suffered. But in Aliceville, something had fundamentally shifted. The German women were no longer just prisoners. They were Margarete and Hilde and Greta and Anna. They had faces, stories, families. The American women were no longer just captors. They were Martha and Sarah and Eleanor. They shared a bond forged in the unlikely crucible of Christmas behind barbed wire. In the months that followed, the relationships deepened. American women taught German prisoners how to make Southern cornbread and grits. German women taught Americans how to make Stollen and Springerl cookies, working within the constraints of rationing to approximate recipes from memory. They exchanged stories about children, about farms and families, about the lives they hoped to return to when the war finally ended. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, the news reached Aliceville on a bright spring morning. The German women received it in silence. Surrender meant the war was over. It also meant facing what had happened to their country, their cities, their families. The celebration that swept through America felt, to them, like mourning. The American women who'd befriended them understood this complicated grief. They didn't expect the German women to celebrate their nation's defeat. Instead, they quietly offered support through the difficult weeks that followed. When letters finally began arriving from Germany describing unimaginable destruction, the prisoners remained in Aliceville for months after the surrender, while arrangements were made for their return to Europe. During that time, the friendships continued. When the first group was finally scheduled to leave in early 1946, there was genuine sadness on both sides. Martha Williams came to the camp the day before Margarete's departure. She brought a package wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a quilt she'd made herself, pieced together from fabric scraps in a pattern called Ocean Waves. "So you'll remember Alabama," Martha said. "And so you'll remember that even in the darkest times, there are people who choose kindness." Margarete held the quilt and felt its weight, the hours of work stitched into every seam. "I could never forget," she said. "When I thought humanity was dead, you showed me it was just sleeping. You and the other women here gave me something to hold on to. Hope, I suppose. The belief that maybe we can build something better than what we destroyed." They embraced at the camp gates, these two women whose countries had spent years trying to annihilate each other. When Margarete climbed onto the transport truck, she clutched the quilt to her chest. She would carry it across the Atlantic, through the ruins of Germany, to a small town outside Munich, where her mother had somehow survived. The quilt would become a family treasure, passed down through generations, its story told and retold as evidence that even in humanity's worst moments, some people refused to let hatred win. The last German prisoners left Aliceville in March 1946. The camp was dismantled, the barracks torn down, the barbed wire removed. Within a few years, only the foundations remained, slowly being reclaimed by kudzu and Alabama clay. The land returned to cotton fields and pine woods, as if 300 women had never spent years of their lives there, as if Christmas 1944 had never happened. But it had happened, and the people who'd been there never forgot. In 1955, 10 years after the war ended, Margarete wrote a letter to Martha Williams. She'd kept Martha's address all those years, carried it through the chaos of post-war Germany. The letter described her life, her return to nursing, her marriage to a schoolteacher, her 2 young daughters. I tell them about Christmas in Alabama, she wrote, about the American women who showed us kindness when they had every reason not to. My daughters ask if that really happened, if people can really be that good. I tell them yes, I met them. I knew them. Martha wrote back. Their correspondence continued for decades. Two old women separated by an ocean, but connected by a memory of choosing humanity when hatred would have been easier. Other women from that Christmas maintained similar connections. Letters crossed the Atlantic carrying photos of grandchildren, recipes, news of deaths and births and weddings. The bonds formed behind barbed wire proved stronger than the war that had created them. In 1984, 40 years after that Christmas party, a group of the former German prisoners returned to Aliceville for a reunion. Most were in their 60s and 70s now, gray-haired and walking slowly. But their memories of that place remained sharp. They met with the American women who'd befriended them, those who were still alive. They walked the grounds where the camp had stood, now just empty fields with historical markers. A local reporter asked Margarete, then 74 years old, what she remembered most about her time as a prisoner. She thought for a long moment. The fear, she said finally. The constant not knowing if your family was alive or dead. The weight of being hated just for your nationality. But also the moment that weight lifted, when those women walked into our barracks carrying gifts and food. I felt human again for the first time in years. They didn't see German prisoners. They saw young women far from home. That made all the difference. The reporter asked if she'd forgiven America for making her a prisoner. Margarete smiled. You misunderstand. I was grateful to be a prisoner in America. I was alive. I was safe. And I met people who taught me that nationality is just an accident of birth, but kindness is a choice. Those Aliceville women chose kindness. They didn't have to. Many people told them not to, but they did it anyway. One of the American women, Eleanor Price's daughter, who'd been a teenager during the war, spoke up. My mother always said that Christmas party was the most important thing she ever did. More important than raising children or serving the church or any of it. Because it was the hardest. It would have been so much easier to hate you all, but she decided that wasn't who she wanted to be. The reunion lasted 3 days. They shared meals, told stories, cried and laughed together. On the final evening, they gathered at the site where the mess hall had stood. Someone had brought a violin. Hilda Braun, now 76 but with steady hands, played Silent Night as the sun set over the Alabama countryside. German and American voices joined together, just as they had 40 years earlier, singing about peace in 2 languages that had once belonged to enemies. When the music ended, they stood in silence, watching darkness settle over the fields. The barbed wire was long gone. The guard towers had vanished, but something remained. Not visible, not tangible, but real. A memory of the day humanity triumphed over hatred, when ordinary people decided that kindness mattered more than nationality, when Christmas broke through the barriers of war. Margarete died in 1991 at age 81. In her will, she left specific instructions for her quilt, the ocean waves pattern Martha Williams had made for her in 1946. It was to be donated to the Alabama Department of Archives and History, to be displayed as a testament to what happened in Aliceville. The quilt now hangs in a museum in Montgomery, its fabric faded, but its story bright. Beside it hangs a photograph from Christmas 1944. The image is grainy, black and white, but you can see them clearly, American and German women standing together, some with arms around each other's shoulders, all of them smiling. In the background, barely visible, are the barbed wire fences and guard towers that defined their circumstances. But in the foreground, in their faces, is something that transcended those circumstances entirely. Today, when historians discuss World War II POW camps, Aliceville is often mentioned as an anomaly. Most camps were strictly utilitarian. House prisoners, put them to work, wait for the war to end. Few developed the kind of relationships that emerged in that small Alabama town. Some scholars attribute it to the camp holding women, arguing that gender dynamics made personal connections more likely. Others point to Colonel Harrison's leadership, or the particular culture of the American South in the 1940s. But those explanations miss something essential. What happened at Aliceville wasn't about gender or leadership or regional culture. It was about individual human beings making individual choices. Martha Williams didn't bake those pies because she was Southern or female. She baked them because she saw suffering and decided to respond with compassion. Sarah Henderson didn't organize that Christmas party because of camp policy. She did it because her conscience demanded it. The lesson of Aliceville is simple and radical. We can choose. Even when everything around us says to hate, to fear, to dehumanize, we can choose differently. Those American women could have spent the entire war seeing only German prisoners and the enemy. They chose to see human beings instead. That choice didn't erase the war or minimize its horrors, but it did prove that individuals can create pockets of humanity even in the midst of organized inhumanity. In 2019, one of Margaretti's granddaughters, a history professor in Berlin, traveled to Aliceville for the 75th anniversary of that Christmas party. She brought letters Margaretti had saved, correspondences with Martha Williams and other Aliceville women spanning 4 decades. At a ceremony, she read excerpts to an audience of townspeople, veterans, and historians. One letter, written by Martha in 1967, captured something essential. People ask me why I did it, why I showed kindness to enemy prisoners. I tell them this: I had a choice between making the world worse or making it better. The war had made things terrible enough. I didn't want to add more hatred, so I chose to add something else instead. Maybe it didn't matter in the grand scheme of things, but it mattered to those young women, and it mattered to me. That's enough. The granddaughter looked up from the letter. My grandmother kept this her whole life. She said it reminded her that ordinary people can do extraordinary things, not through grand gestures or heroic acts, but through simple human kindness offered when it's least expected and most needed. That's the truth at the heart of the Aliceville story. Christmas 1944 wasn't a miracle in the supernatural sense. No laws of nature were suspended. No divine intervention occurred. The miracle was simpler and more profound. In the middle of the worst war in human history, a group of people decided that compassion mattered more than nationality. They saw beyond uniforms and barbed wire to the human beings beneath. And in doing so, they created something that outlasted the war, outlasted most of the participants, and continues to challenge us today. Because the question Aliceville poses is uncomfortable, if those women could choose kindness toward literal enemies during wartime, what's our excuse for failing to show compassion to people we disagree with during peacetime? If they could cross lines of nationality, language, and recent trauma to recognize shared humanity, why do we struggle to cross much smaller divides? The answer isn't that they were better people. They were ordinary women with ordinary prejudices and fears. Some initially opposed the idea of helping German prisoners. Some participated reluctantly. But they did participate. They made the choice, even when it was hard, even when neighbors criticized them, even when grief over their own losses made hatred feel justified. That's the enduring power of the Aliceville story. It strips away our excuses. It proves that choosing humanity is possible, even in the darkest circumstances. And it asks us to consider what we're choosing every day in our own lives, in our own smaller wars, in our own encounters with people we've been told to see as other. The barracks are gone. The fences have vanished. Most of the people who lived this story have died. But the choice they made remains, preserved in letters and quilts and photographs, in stories passed down through families, in the historical record. Every year, people visit the site in Aliceville, standing in fields that once held a prison camp, trying to imagine what happened there. What happened was this. People looked at enemies and chose to see neighbors. They looked at prisoners and chose to see daughters. They looked at Christmas and chose to share it with those who had no claim to their generosity. In doing so, they created a moment that proves what humanity can be when we decide to be our best selves rather than our worst. That's not a wartime story. That's a timeless story, and it matters now as much as it mattered then, maybe more. Because we all face our own barbed wire, our own barriers between us and them, our own temptations to hatred disguised as justice. The women of Aliceville show us there's another way, harder, requiring more courage, but possible, always possible, even at Christmas, especially at Christmas, even behind barbed wire.